Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Voice of Islam Living History program. My name is Dr. Mohammed Iqbal. I'm your host for today's program. I'm joined by our panel of experts, Amjad Hussain Saab, a scientist and a person with great interest in history. Welcome, Amjad.
Thank you very much.
And Arif Ahmad again, not a scientist by background, because today's discussion is based on sciences, but a great person with interest in our living history programs. Arif, welcome again.
Thank you, Dr.
In today's program, in fact, in the next two programs, we're going to talk about COVID-19 and the history of pandemics. I'm sure everybody will be familiar now with the name of COVID-19 and the coronavirus that is causing havoc throughout the world. So far, over 18.6 million cases of infections have been reported worldwide, with 702,045 deaths due to COVID-19 have occurred in over 188 countries. The highest number has been in the USA with 4.8 million cases. I think over 157,000 deaths as of 5th of August 2020. This is followed by Brazil with 2.8 million infections were reported. And much of this information can be seen from the Coronavirus Resource Center at Johns Hopkins University. I'm sure that if you follow the news, you'll hear what's going on a regular basis. We will, in the Living History program, we will endeavor to shed some light on this topic in this program as it unfolds, looking in particular to the background of the viruses, where they come from, how they're defined, etc., and history of some of the pandemics. And then in part two, we will look at COVID in particular and some of the issues that are associated with it. So I'm going to start off with Amjad. In fact, Amjad and I are both scientists, so if we get carried away, Arif, you're the non-scientist in our panel. Please bring us back to the things that our broad listeners are interested in, because science is such a fascinating subject. So Amjad, I'll start with yourself. Just tell us a little bit about the viruses and what's going on, and then we'll sort of get to more details.
Well, obviously, there are many myths associated with viruses. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of things, let me begin by saying that we all live, prosper, and thrive in a cloud of viruses. And our species, as humankind, have been doing so for the last, hundreds of thousands of years or so. Viruses infect all living things on this planet. That includes plants, trees, birds, fish, animals, and us human beings too. Knowingly and unknowingly, we eat and breathe billions of virus particles each day. We all carry viral genome as part of our genetic material. This we inherited from our forefathers and foremothers through evolutionary process. As viruses infect every living thing on this earth, therefore all species carry viral genetic material as part of their chromosomal DNA, and that includes microscopic organisms, insects, flies, and so on. So viruses are everywhere and have been with us for millions of years or so.
The numbers, Amjad, are absolutely mind-boggling, aren't they, in relation to how widespread? Just take us through for listeners, because I think this will be an interesting series of facts and figures for them in relation to how widespread.
Yes, true. The virus did not just pop up, in Chinese city of Wuhan in the in the winter of 2019, so to speak, but more about that in the next program. Number of viruses on this earth is just mind-boggling. And those that are familiar with molecular biology think that these infections happen with some of these outbreaks, and that's when the viruses come into the limelight. The fact is that, when we speak, there are billions of viruses and they are everywhere. Let's quantify this by putting some numbers on it. If we just look at the viruses that infect bacteria, for instance, in the oceans, there are obviously lots of microbes in the oceans along with viruses. The virus that infects these bacteria in the waters of this world are called bacteriophages. Scientists have taken samples from various parts of the world's oceans and done some measurements and particle counts. The numbers are just huge. In fact, they are bigger than the Avogadro's number. And if you remember basic GCSE chemistry, where 1 mole of substance contains 6 times 10 to the 23 numbers of atoms or molecules in 1 mole, and compare that with this 10 to the 30th in comparison.
Just for the non-scientists, I think we should just say that 10 to the 30 means 10 with 30 zeros, is what my understanding is.
Absolutely.
So as you can see, it's a very, very big number.
Sometimes we don't appreciate exactly, yeah.
And so if, this number 10 to the 30 with 30 zeros and Arif is absolutely correct. And if we take the particle mass of a bacteriophage, that is 10 to the minus 15 grams, or a femtogram, and multiply this by this 10 to the 30th figure, this gives us the biomass on the planet of on this planet of bacterioviruses alone that exceeds the biomass of elephants combined, and not just but actually 1,000-fold more than the biomass of the elephants. And to put it another way, to illustrate this, if we line up all the 10 to the 30th bacteriophages head to tail, they will stretch 100 million light years into space. And by this way, this is just the number of viruses in the oceans alone. And this was to qualify and quantify my introductory remarks that we live and thrive and breathe billions of viruses every day.
Absolutely. I mean, I that gives a good introduction to how widespread these viruses are. You're looking at enormous numbers and spread. But our bodies are also full of microbes with viruses, etc. Arif, just talk us through a little bit. I know in today's program we're going to speak more specifically about viruses, but obviously there's all sorts of microbes in our body and in the world as well.
Yeah, just to set the scene and the terminology. So the human microbiome, this is the aggregate or the accumulation of all of the microbes or microbiota that reside on our skin and within our bodies and biofluids, along with the corresponding anatomical sites in which they live and thrive. So this includes our skin, mammary glands, placenta, uterus, follicles, lungs, nasal, gastrointestinal tracts. And the types of human microbiota, this includes bacteria, archaea, fungi, protists, and viruses. So, in summary, we humans, we've been colonized by these microorganisms, and they live and thrive on and inside our bodies. Most of them are not pathogenic and don't cause us any harm, and they actually perform functions that are mutually advantageous, and they coexist without harming us. So it's estimated that these amount to about 38 trillion bacteria. And most intriguing is probably the fact that bacteria are not actually the most abundant microbes that live in or on our bodies. That actually goes to viruses. So there's actually 10 times as much. That's 380 million trillion viruses inhabiting our bodies. So again, big numbers.
Oh, amazing little things. I think most listeners, when we talk about viruses, will be familiar with the big names like HIV/AIDS. It was on the news for many decades, and people know. Currently, the World Health Organization states that there are 38 million people worldwide that are living with HIV virus at the end of 2019. Another virus which listeners may be familiar with is the human alpha herpes virus 3, also known as Bacillus zoster virus. Now, this is one of 9 herpes viruses known to infect humans. It causes the well-known chickenpox, a disease that commonly affects children and teens. These viruses stay dormant quite often in some cells for life without causing disease. So, many people are infected with them for life. A number of vaccines clearly have been developed for these, and I won't go into those, but people are vaccinated against chickenpox, measles, rubella, etc., so everybody will be familiar with those. So that provides a little bit of the background viruses. Let's get to the science a little more. What actually is a virus, Amjad? I mean, for the listeners, just try to define it.
Well, obviously, the scientists will have many definitions, and there are, of course, numerous definitions in textbooks. There are typically ultramicroscopic infectious agents, and they have nucleic acid core. Viruses replicates inside the living cells of a host organism. The name virus actually comes from the Latin word. It means slimy liquid or poison. Virus is infectious, obligate, intracellular, parasite comprising genetic material, either DNA or RNA, often surrounded by a protein coat and sometimes a membrane. So now this is a bit of a mouthful. So
break it down for us.
Yes.
What each of those means.
It is a bit scientific. So, so when we say virus is infectious, because it can go from host to host and multiply, that's what we mean by infection. Obligate intercellular means that the virus needs to enter the host cell to reproduce. Virus is parasitic, and that simply means that it takes nutrients from the host cells. That also includes the ones that are usually harmless to us and happily coexist with us. And they also sometimes take something from us as well in order to survive. They need energy, they need sugars, and so on. So viruses have genomes, and that can be either DNA or RNA. For instance, influenza virus has DNA genome, whereas the herpes virus has RNA genome. This is also an indicator. When these nucleic acids, they indicate where the virus actually comes from, and we can sequence them to determine their origin. And viruses are surrounded by either a protein coat, sometimes a membrane. And the reason for this is that they need to bind to the host cell. They need to stick to something and get inside. For example, coronavirus has a membrane, and in addition to those crown-like cones that now has been become familiar with, and they need to bind to the receptor sites inside our lung cells. Majority of these viruses have been around for millions, if not billions of years. And if they can find a suitable host, then that is the end of them. If they can't find a host, then they will simply die. The study of viruses also involves the study of hosts as well. So be it in plant, humans, bacteria, and so on. Without knowing the cell biology, we cannot completely understand virus behavior. This is also the case with coronavirus. So the idea is not to become a willing host, hence the drastic measures that have been taken to prevent it spreading. And we will talk about this in our later program. As viruses are obligate molecular parasite, every solution to combat them must also reveal something about the host as well as the virus itself.
Now, because viruses are so small, early on, many of the civilizations and scientists didn't have a clear idea what these agents were. So it's only much more recently when we've had the technology to explain and investigate and see. So just take us through, Arif, in relation to the size, because it'd be difficult for listeners on a radio program to appreciate fully. But this is important when we look at how viruses reproduce and spread and why they are so numerous.
Yes, absolutely. Again, it's very difficult to convey this without pictures. But just as an example, you can fit 500 million rhinoviruses on a single pinhead. So we all know what a single pinhead is. A pinhead might be 2 millimeters wide, and rhinoviruses is what normally gives us the common cold. Let's try and break that down into a little bit more as an example. So, for example, if we take a typical ant, that is usually about 1 centimeter in size. And if we go something smaller than that, for example, a frog's egg, I think it's called frog spawn, from which tadpoles are born, that might be 1 millimeter in size. And the typical size of a human egg is about 0.1 millimeter. So we're going down in degrees of 10, starting from 1 centimeter to 1 millimeter to 0.1 millimeter. Another way of measuring that, or another terminology for that, is 100 microns. 1 micron, if I understand correctly, is a millionth of a meter. So 0.1 millimeter is the size of a human egg. And that's just about the limit of the naked human eye. And you have to have very, very good eyesight to be able to see that. If we go down further and we look at the size of a sperm, that's typically 60 microns. We wouldn't be able to see that with the human eye. We'd need optical light microscopy. If we go down further to a red blood cell, that's typically 5 microns. But to get to the size of bacteria are only 0.5 to 1.5 microns in size. And viruses are even smaller, another degree of 10. So we're talking about 0.05 to 0.1 microns. And that's into nanometer territory. And just to explain what a nanometer is 1 billionth of a meter. So if you take a meter and divide it by a billion, that's what we're talking about here. Now, obviously, these viruses, you can't even see them with a normal optical microscope. You have to use electron microscope, a very powerful electron scanning microscope. They're required to be able to study them. So it just gives you a sense of, of what we're trying to see here, how small it is. And we have to understand that, because obviously to study these, we need specialist equipment.
So, Amjad, one of the things we've noticed in the campaigns around coronavirus is the sort of phase between somebody getting infected and then spreading it to others, and the containment phase. And viruses are quite different to bacteria as pathogens. Just explain to us, because they're really interesting agents, aren't they? How they actually infect. So just take us through some of the science of the difference between the bacteria spread and viruses.
Absolutely, Dr. Saab. This is also a basic difference between how you put it, bacteria and a virus, how they reproduce. For instance, if I take a single bacteria and put it into a broth, it will begin to divide into 2, and then 2 into 4, and the 4 into 8, and the 8 into 16, and so on. Kind of binary fusion. It just multiplies. On the other hand, if you put a virus into a broth, it does absolutely nothing. It needs cells. Once it gets inside the cell, it will not divide like the bacteria. It will take time, and it will make parts. It will capture the genetic material from the whole cell. Then it will start to make a factory and produce more copies of itself. Just the way it behaves is fundamentally different from the bacteria of reproducing itself. Thus, hence, we have the time lag. So people can have the infection, be infected by a virus, but they will not notice it. For a number of days. So if you add a virus to a cell, nothing happens for a while, because no new viruses are being made, and this is called the eclipse time. This duration depends on the type of a virus, a kind of a virus, and how long it will take to gather different material for self-replication. So after some time has ellipsed, infectious particles begin to be made, and this is important concept. To remember that viruses must assemble using preformed components. So they need preformed components already in a whole cell to multiply and to. So when we were at the university, one of our professors gave an analogy, and that is like going to IKEA and getting a flat pack. And you get the flat pack, it is in your car or a van, and it sits there and nothing happens. You bring it home, after you spend some time and effort, and bingo, the flat pack turns into a piece of furniture. And now you have the template that came with it, which you could, of course, use to make some more copies of it if you desired, if you had the tools and so on. In a nutshell, this is how exactly virus produces itself. So, otherwise it will just sit there, harmlessly, do absolutely nothing for days, and it will, some say after, few days, depending on different types of material, it will die. So this is very important concept to get our head around.
I think in the second part of this program, we're going to talk about the endemics and pandemics and how we've understood viruses. But perhaps just to finish with how old viruses are, because that in itself is a fascinating question in terms of how life emerged on this planet. Clearly, these are very, very small agents made with proteins and the type of nucleic acids you mentioned. And it goes back to origins of life. Did proteins come first? Did RNA come first? Did DNA come first? Perhaps we could just talk through that and then finish the first part of the program. Arif, how old? Probably go back to the very origins of life, doesn't it?
Yes, it goes back a long time. So we can sequence the genome of so many viruses now, but the oldest known in literature is about 450 million years ago. This dates to the Ordovician period of geological time, and this is a period in which fish and land plants began to emerge. They are possibly older, and some suggest that viruses originated before cells. That likely took place billions of years ago. The trouble with nucleic acids is that they disintegrate over time, and so our fossils, which obviously provides a lot of history, they do not have any DNA or RNA material that old that we can extract, sequence and study. The first viruses, they were actually self-replicating nucleic acids which could replicate outside of cells. And this is one of the ideas about the origin of life on Earth. So in essence, viruses go back to the beginning of time, to the beginning of development. And it's very difficult to say, whether they're after life started or even predate life. But we can say that they've been around for a very, very, very long time.
I mean, Amjad, you're a scientist. You and I have sort of probably followed this a lot closer, because the beginning of life is split up into three main domains of life: the archaea, bacteria, and eukaryote cells. These are the original small cells, and it's thought that viruses probably were around as early, even earlier than that, perhaps.
Absolutely, because these are microorganisms that have cells inside them, and obviously, if Arif expressed about the scale earlier on, and that is a very interesting indeed, because we said we started with the ant on the scale, and then the frog's egg, and if you keep going smaller and smaller, and then we're going further back in time, and so the viruses are in between amino acids and bacteria and so on. So there is a debate, there's a lively debate among the academics and among people, what came first is like a chicken and an egg, but I think Arif has said this, they've been around for a very, very long time. Basically, they were there at the beginning of life itself.
The interesting thing is, I was reading about the human genome project as well, which took billions and billions of years, and I think it was 10, 15 years to produce. And interestingly, they discovered even in the human genome, quite a large percentage, I think they were saying something like, 3.08% or whatever percentage it was, of actual viral DNA that had got into it. So viruses have been infected life as it has been evolving and progressing, and it's got incorporated. So part of our actual genome is also made up of viruses, and no doubt many other living organisms. This is probably a good point to now stop, and then in the second part we will talk about the pathogenicity and the historical developments of how we came across viruses and what they did. You've been listening to the Voice of Islam Living History program. In today's program, we've been talking about COVID-19, coronavirus, and really the origins of some of the epidemics and pandemics as well. In today's program, we've just provided an insight into what viruses are, where they come from, how widespread they are, etc. And in the second part, of course, we're going to talk about some of the pandemics, etc. Please do give us your feedback in relation to Living History programs, to our hashtag, which is VI Arif.
At VI Living History.
VI Living History. We'd love to hear your feedback on what you think of this program and other programs. If you want to listen to our other programs, go to the website www.voiceofislam.co.uk, and under programs Living History, you'll see, I think, we've done about 27, 28 programs, Arif.
I think we're on the 28th now.
28, yeah. So there's a whole variety, from origins of life, origins of the universe, to how language developed, how different civilizations developed, and in particular, Islamic civilization, the different stages of it as well. So do please listen to those and give us your feedback. We'll be back very shortly.
You're listening to the Voice of Islam Radio, broadcasting on DAB and via the internet 24 hours a day.
Welcome back to the Voice of Islam Living History program. This is the second part now. We were talking about viruses, COVID, an introduction really to COVID and viruses in particular. How widespread they are, what they look like, how they work, how they reproduce, etc. And now in the second part, really, we want to come across the impact they've had on human history. Firstly, just definitions, I suppose. So when we talk about viruses causing infections, we talk in terms of endemics and pandemics. And just for listeners, I'm sure many will be familiar with this, but endemics are when the infections are more localized, rapidly spreading, and pandemics really are when they become global, rapid spread, where things just start getting out of hand. And COVID is certainly at the pandemic stage at the moment. So epidemics caused by viruses began when human behavior changed during the Neolithic period. That's the sort of Stone Age period around 12,000 years ago, when humans developed more densely populated agricultural communities. Before that, they were living as hunter-gatherers, well spread out, etc. So you'll understand why social distancing becomes so important. This allowed viruses to spread rapidly and subsequently to become endemic. Viruses of plants and livestock also increased as humans became dependent on agriculture and farming. Diseases such as potiviruses of potatoes and rinderpest of cattle had devastating consequences.
I think there's just one thing, Dr. Sab, about endemic, just to explain to listeners. As I understand, endemic means something which is sort of all the time present within the population.
Yeah, living with it and trying to get used to it.
For example, like the flu. The flu virus never ever really goes away. There are certain times of the year when it's more prevalent, but endemic means it's always there.
No, I'm glad that this is why I said me and Amjad might carry away with our sciences, but that's good. Thank you, Arif, for that. So most listeners will be familiar with the smallpox and measles and the devastation they've caused in human history. Amjad, I'm going to start off with you. Maybe you could take us through our earliest records and dealings and understanding of viruses and their impact on humanity in prehistory. Just take us through maybe the period 50,000 to 100,000 years ago or so.
As modern humans increased in numbers and dispersed throughout the world, new infectious diseases emerged, including those caused by viruses. Earlier, humans lived in small, isolated communities, and most endemic diseases did not exist. Smallpox, which is the most lethal and devastating viral infection in history, first emerged among agricultural communities in India about 11,000 years ago. The virus, which only infects humans, probably descended from pox viruses of rodents. Humans probably came into contact with these rodents, and some people became infected by the virus they carried. When viruses cross the so-called species barrier, their effect can be severe, and humans may have had little natural resistance to it. Contemporary humans lived in small communities too, and those who succumbed to infection either died or developed immunity. This acquired immunity is only passed down to offsprings temporarily by antibodies in breast milk and other antibodies that cross the placenta from the mother's blood to the unborn child. Therefore, sporadic outbreaks probably occurred in each generation. In about 9000 BC, when many people began to settle on fertile floodplains, for instance, River Nile, the population became dense enough for the viruses to maintain a constant presence because of the high concentration of susceptible people. Other endemics of viral diseases that depends on large concentration of people, such as mumps, rubella, and polio, also first occurred about this time as well, Dr. Saab.
So, Arif, if we sort of jump to the Neolithic or Stone Age era, which began in the Middle East about, 9,500 years BC. Just take us through the impact of viruses, because clearly human society now living much more closer together.
Yes, so this is sort of like the final part of the Stone Age, and this is a time when humans started to become farmers. And this agricultural revolution, this embraced the development of monoculture. And monoculture is where you're basically growing one type of crop or, rearing one type of animal in a field. And what this did is it presented an opportunity for the rapid spread of several species of plant viruses. And the divergence and spread of these so-called zoonoviruses, southern bean mosaic virus date from this time. The spread of potyviruses, of potatoes and other fruit and vegetables also began about 6,600 years ago. About 10,000 years ago, the humans who inhabited the lands around the Mediterranean basin, they began to domesticate wild animals, so pigs, cattle, goats, horse, camels. They were all kept and bred in captivity. And those animals would have brought their viruses with them. And the transmission of viruses from animals to humans can occur. This is one of the, I don't know whether this has been finally agreed or not, that maybe this is where coronavirus, people saying it came from bats. I think the jury's still out on that. So these are called zoonotic infections. They are quite rare, and the subsequent human-to-human transmission of animal virus is even rarer, although there are notable exceptions such as influenza. What we see is that most viruses are species-specific, and they would have posed no threat to humans. The rare epidemics of viral diseases originating in animals would have been short-lived because the viruses were not fully adapted to humans, and the human populations were too small to maintain the chains of infection. And I think this goes back to the point you were making, Dr. Sab, about social distancing. When there are dense populations, obviously it's easier for viruses to pass on. Other more ancient viruses, they've been less of a threat. So the herpes viruses, they first infected the ancestors of humans over 80 million years ago. Humans have developed a tolerance to these viruses, and most are infected with at least one species. Records of these milder viruses infections are rare, but it's likely that the early hominids suffered from colds, influenza, and diarrhea caused by viruses, just as humans are today. More recently, evolved viruses caused epidemics and pandemics, and it is these that history records. The influenza virus is one that seems to have crossed the species barrier from ducks to waterfowl to pigs and there to humans, and it's possible that there was a fatal plague in the Middle East at the time of the late 18th dynasty, which was associated with its transmission at Amarna.
And during antiquity, clearly a lot more written record was being passed on to us about what was happening to civilization around that time, especially in relation to, famine and great disasters, including epidemics, etc. And the Egyptians probably had good records. Just take us through both sort of what the Egyptian and Roman records and other civilizations' records show.
Among the earliest records of viral infection, you're absolutely right, is recorded on an Egyptian stela thought to depict an Egyptian priest from the 18th dynasty, and thus about 1580 to 1350 BC, with the foot drop deformity, which is characteristic of poliovirus infection. The mummy of Sifra, a ruler during the 19th dynasty, shows signs of poliomyelitis, and that of Ramesses V, and some other Egyptian mummies buried over 3,000 years ago show evidence of a smallpox. And I think we talked about the degeneracy of RNA and DNA, and this is about the period we can actually extract the DNA of some of those mummies, because if they're well preserved or not, and if the DNA has not been disintegrated. There was 3,000 years ago the evidence of smallpox, and there was an epidemic apparently of a smallpox in Athens in 430 BC, in which quarter of the Athenian army and many of the city's civilians died from this infection. The Antonio plague of 165 to 180 of the Common Era, probably smallpox outbreak, pandemic, that wiped out around 5 million people in the Roman Empire, which included...
I mean, in those days, that would have been a lot of people.
Oh, absolutely. That was devastating for Britain and Europe, the Middle East, because remember, the Roman Empire covered, the British Isles, much of Europe, and the Middle East as far as North Africa. The pandemic began after the Roman soldiers who were sent to suppress an uprising in what is now Iraq plundered the city of Seleucia on the river Tigris, and at the same time they were infected. They brought the disease back to Rome and obviously subsequently passed it on to Europe, where up to 5,000 people a day were fatally infected. At its height, the pandemic reached India and China, it is thought.
If one of the most detailed accounts of the pathogens like the viruses, etc., was during the Muslim civilization. Just take us through. Razi's played a big part in that, didn't he, in communicating? I think Ibn Sina, Avicenna also did a lot of work on infections as well. But just take us through the measles and other viruses.
Yes, so the Persian physician Noza Razis, who lived from 865 to 925, he first identified, or he's believed to first identified measles. And he used the Arabic name Hasba for measles. It's got many other names, including rubiola, from the Latin words rubius, which means red, and mobile, which means small plague. And the close similarities between the measles virus and the canine distemper virus and rinderpest virus has given rise to speculation that measles was first transmitted to humans from domesticated dogs or cattle. The measles virus appears to fully diverge from the then widespread rinderpest virus by the 12th century. Now, many of you will know that if you get measles, you get lifelong immunity. And so the virus requires a high population density to become endemic. This probably didn't happen in the Neolithic, in the Stone Age. However, following the emergence of the virus in the Middle East, it reached India by 2500 BC. And measles was so common in children at that time that it was not even recognized as a disease. If you look at the Egyptian hieroglyphs, it was described as a normal stage of human development. So it was almost as though this was something which was normal that was going to happen to you in childhood. One of the earliest descriptions of a virus-infected plant can also be found in a poem written by the Japanese Empress Kokin, who lived from 718 to 770, in which she describes a plant in summer with yellowing leaves. The plant, later identified as Euphorbia lidellum, is often infected with tomato yellow leaf curl virus. So you can see that viruses are coming from plants, they're coming from animals, and often, but not always, they're being passed on to humans as well.
Amjad, as we moved to the Middle Ages, clearly there was a better and deeper understanding of some of these infectious agents as well. And just to take the example of rabies, this was a disease that had been recognized for over 4,000 years and it was quite rife in Europe. But thankfully, a vaccine was developed by Louis Pasteur in 1886. Just take us during the Middle Age phases, some of the developments, and both in terms of discoveries of treatment as well as the spread of the things, please.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct, Dr. Sab. Rabies is a disease that has been recognized, as you rightly said, for 4,000 years, and it was rife in Europe, and it continued to be so until the development of vaccine, and you're right in that as well. This was Louis Pasteur in 1888 who developed this vaccine. The average life expectancy in Europe at that time, during the Middle Ages, was about 35 years. 60% of children died before the age of 16, many of them during their first 6 years of life. Physicians, what few they were, relied as much as on astrology. Obviously, the
wishful thinking.
Medicine was not highly developed. We know all that, and the limited medical knowledge. So some treatments for infections obviously consisted of ointments prepared from cats and had been roasted, hedgehog fat and so forth. And among the plethora of diseases that caused childhood death were measles, influenza, and smallpox. The Crusades and the Muslim conquest aided the spread of, unfortunately, this smallpox, which was the causes of the frequent endemics in Europe following its introduction to the continent between the 5th and the 7th Crusades. Measles was endemic throughout the highly populated countries of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. In England, the disease, then called measles, was first described, am I correct in that? Was first described in the 13th century, and it was probably one of the 49 plagues that occurred between 526 and the year 1087. Rinderpest, which is caused by a virus closely related to measles virus, is a disease of cattle known since Roman times. The disease, which originated in Asia, was first brought to Europe by the invading Huns in 370. Later invasion of Mongols led by Genghis Khan and his army started pandemics in Europe. In the first one in 1222, followed by 1233, and the last invasion 1238. The infection subsequently reached England following the importation of cattle from the continent. At the time of the Rinderpest was a devastating disease with a mortality rate of 80 to 90%. The resulting loss of cattle caused famines in Europe.
So, Arif, as we move between the sort of 14th century to the 19th century, clearly our knowledge base was increasing, and especially in relation to influenza epidemics and infections. Just to take us through that period and what new developments were.
Well, as we said, the influenza virus probably was there well before the 15th and 16th century, but this is when it first started becoming documented. So even if we look before, in 1173, there was an epidemic that caused what was probably the first outbreak in Europe. And in 1493, there was an outbreak of what is now known to be the swine influenza. This struck Native Americans. Now, there is some evidence to suggest that the source of this infection was pigs on Columbus's ships. And it's interesting to see how viruses can go from one continent to another continent through a very unorthodox mean. So during an influenza epidemic that occurred in England between 1557 and 1559, 5% of the population, that's about 150,000 people, they died from the infection. So we're seeing how devastating these outbreaks are. That mortality rate was nearly 5 times as much as the 1918 to 1919 pandemic. I think that was the Spanish flu epidemic. And the first pandemic that was reliably recorded began in July 1580 and swept across Europe, Africa and Asia. The mortality rate, again, was very high. 8,000 died in Rome. The next 3 pandemics occurred in the 18th century, including that during 1781 to 1802, which is probably the most devastating in history. This began in November 1781 in China, and it reached Moscow in December. In February 1782, it hit St. Petersburg, and by May, it had reached Denmark. So within 6 weeks, 75% of the British population were infected, and the pandemic soon spread to the Americas. And there's an interesting parallel between that and what's happening with coronavirus. You can see it started in China and reached to America. The Americas and Australasia, because of the distance, they remained free of measles and smallpox until the arrival of European colonists between the 15th and 18th centuries. Along with measles and influenza, smallpox was taken to America by the Spanish. Smallpox was endemic in Spain, having been.
This was a devastation unknown. Amjad, if you want to take us through what happened to the South American civilizations, because obviously many of them were slaughtered through war and whatever, but I think the damage done by just take us sort of from the Spanish and Portuguese exploration of from 1519 onwards. Yeah?
Yes, this was absolutely decimated the population of, basically what they then call the New World, and now we call Latin America. In 1519, an endemic of smallpox broke out in the Aztec capital Teotihuacan in Mexico. This was started by the army, obviously by the Spanish army from Cuba, and had an African slave suffering from the smallpox aboard his ship, one of the admirals, Spanish admirals. When the Spanish finally entered the capital in the summer of 1521, they saw strewn with bodies of smallpox victims, and that's the native, basically, Aztec, Mexican Indians, and the endemic and those that followed during the 1545 to 1548, and then this other one in 1576 to 81, eventually killed more than half of the native population. Some estimates say actually up to 3/4 of the population, which basically decimated the culture. So most of the Spanish were already immune, and so with his army of fewer than 900 men, it could not have been possible for Cortes to defeat the Aztecs and conquer Mexico without the help of smallpox. Many Native American populations were devastated later by the inadvertent spread of diseases introduced by Europeans. In the 150 years that followed Columbus's arrival in 1492, the Native American population of North America, for instance, were reduced by 80% from diseases including measles, smallpox, and influenza. The damage done by these diseases significantly aided European attempts to displace and conquer the native population. By the 18th century, smallpox was endemic in Europe. There were 5 epidemics in London between 1719 and 1746, and the large outbreaks occurred in other major European cities. By the end of century, about 400,000 Europeans were dying from the disease each year. It reached South Africa in 1713, having been carried by ships from India. And in 1789, the disease struck Australia. In the 19th century, smallpox became the single most important cause of death of Australian Aborigines.
I think one thing you note from this is the devastating impact these epidemics were having in Europe, and also how they spread across to other nations, because clearly the Europeans were spreading everywhere. Just as the Mongols, we talked earlier, had spread diseases when they conquered most of the world, here now Europeans were spreading it. I think we've got very little time, so let's move now towards the 20th century, Arif, because here we had new technology and discovery of new agents and treatments and new types of viruses. So let's conclude a little bit with a quick overview of the 20th century.
Yes, obviously technology had been developing, and evidence for the existence of viruses. This was obtained from experiments with filters that had pores too small for bacteria to pass through them. So the term filterable virus was coined to describe them. Until the 1930s, most scientists believed that viruses were small bacteria. But following the invention of the electron microscope in 1931, they were shown to be a completely different type of organism, to a degree that not all scientists were convinced they were anything other than accumulations of toxic proteins. The situation changed radically when it was discovered that viruses contain genetic material in the form of DNA or RNA, as has been mentioned by Amjad Saab earlier on in this program. And once they were recognized as distinct biological entities, they were soon shown to be the cause of numerous infections of plants, animals, and even other bacteria. Of the many diseases that humans that were found to be caused by viruses in the 20th century, smallpox is the one that's been eradicated. The diseases caused by viruses such as HIV and influenza virus, these have proved to be more difficult to control. Other diseases such as those caused by arboviruses, which I think are from trees, they're presenting new challenges. As humans have changed their behavior during history, so have viruses. In ancient times, the human population was too small for pandemics to occur because obviously they were living farther apart. And in the case of some viruses, too small for them to survive. In the 20th and the 21st century, increasing population density and revolutionary changes in agriculture and farming methods and high-speed travel have contributed to the spread of new viruses and the reappearance of old ones.
So that's been a bird's eye view of viruses and their impact on human history. And of course now we've got COVID, we had HIV before that, and MERS as well before that. In the next program, inshallah, we will talk in a lot more detail about some of these new viruses and the massive impact they're having on the world. Hope listeners have found this informative and useful. Thank you to both Arif and Amjad for sharing their insights with us. Don't forget, please do send us your feedback on this program and other programs on at VI Living History, and also go to the website www.voiceofislam.co.uk, and under the programs you'll see all our different programs on our podcasts, and I hope you will enjoy them. So until the next program, Assalamu alaikum.